Good morning, everybody. I'm Walter Christ, and I'm here with Matthew Stevenson, who you'll see in a little bit. We're going to talk to you about our research and our work to compile evidence reconstructing historical games for the Digital Looting Project. So most of you have probably already heard about the Digital Looting Project a little bit, but if you haven't yet, it's a 3-year ERC-funded project run by Cameron Brown. We are attempting to document historical evidence for traditional games from around the world from the last 5,500 years, and use this historical data to reconstruct the rules of the games. So we're going to model and preserve that knowledge of games from the past, use that knowledge to reconstruct what's missing from it, and then map the transmission of games between cultures. And it's important for us to note here that we're only dealing with traditional games, which we are kind of broadly defining as games that are not invented for commercial sale or for kind of intellectual interest of the inventor. We're using an evidence-based approach, as everyone at this conference is probably familiar. There's a lot of information out there about ancient games and historical games, and a lot of that is not based on any kind of tangible evidence. So we are using this project to document and be honest about where we are getting our information. So we're considering evidence anything that provides a piece of information about rules, location, or chronology of a specific game. And so we are using a couple of different kinds of sources for this kind of that we're calling evidence. So artifacts that are found in archaeological excavations, texts, which can be either descriptions of rules by somebody who knows how to play the game, or other kinds of literary text where a game is attested. For instance, the game of Merrills or Nine Men's Morris is attested in Shakespeare. Ethnographic accounts of when people went to another culture and learned a game that they played there and told us something about the rules of the game. And also artistic representations where we have a piece of art, a sculpture, a painting, where someone has depicted people playing a game that we can reasonably identify. And so we use all this evidence to give us information about the pieces of information that make up board games, which we call lootemes. We won't get too much into defining what they are, but they're the little bits of information that make up a game, like the size of the board, the number of pieces, the starting position, things like this. And then a bunch of lootemes make up a rule set, and a rule set makes up a game, or several rule sets might make up a game. We're defining games kind of mechanically and culturally. So in some cases we might have games that are mechanically identical, but we're calling them different games because of cultural reasons that we can't necessarily say it's the same game played in the same place, because they might not have the same origin. So I already talked to you a little bit about the kinds of evidence, but the different kinds of evidence that we are compiling give us different kinds of information. So artifacts, if we find game boards, they give us the board size and layout. Sometimes we'll have pieces, so that might tell us something about pieces or dice that are used. Artistic representations can tell us things about who's playing the games, where people play games, maybe the board layout if it's a good representation. Text can tell us sometimes the full rule set, but also information about who's playing games. And ethnography also gives us sometimes, most of the time it's pieces of the rule set, but sometimes you get the whole, a whole rule set, and also who plays them and where people play them and that kind of thing. And there are variations in the levels of information that we get from all of these sources. So for something to be a piece of evidence in our database, it has to provide one of these kinds of information that we see here on the left. So it has to provide something about the game rules, whether that's the materials that are used, the board, the number of pieces, the dice, what the players do, or do they play against each other, or do they play on teams, are there multiple players, just two players, It has to be able to be fixed in a geographic location. That could be a point or a region. It also has to have, we also have to be able to provide some kind of chronological information to place it within a range of time. And then also, this isn't necessary for us, but we are also collecting information on class, gender, age, and space, which are all social factors that might affect the way that games are transmitted through time. And so I'll just briefly talk about uncertainty factors, which is something that we have to consider when dealing with this evidence for ancient games, is that a lot of what we have is kind of in some ways unreliable. So we see here on the right a fragment of a game board, which we think is a game of 58 holes based on what we know of complete boards and how they look like. This fits that, but we don't have the full board, so we don't, there's a little bit of uncertainty. It could be something else. So there are all kinds of situations where uncertainty is introduced into the evidence. So we are kind of documenting which of these are applied to each piece of evidence, and we will use that in our analysis to calculate the amount of uncertainty that is related to these games. And so I mentioned this already, but all of this evidence provides information on all of the different kinds of the levels of our conceptualization of games in our research. So we will be using them, identifying the ludemes that we have for the games that are supported by evidence, identifying which ones are missing to make up a rule set. Then we will be borrowing ludemes from other games that we've identified from other places, either places nearby or places from the same time period, and using AI to reconstruct them. So as of a couple of weeks ago, we have reached our target of 1,000 games in the database, which you can access and browse at ludi.games/library.php. We have games from about 3,500 BCE until today, from all continents except for Australia and obviously Antarctica. So I just want to show you a couple of examples of the games in our databases. So Hnefatafl, which everyone knows, we have a screenshot of some of the playable versions that we have in the Ludi software. We have a short description below that tells us a little bit about the cultural information about the game. Below that is the rules, which are the rules that we have been able to document from the evidence. And then below that we have a couple of what we call suggested rule sets. I'll talk about that a little bit more in when we talk about Senate, but these are rule sets that people have made to play what they think Hnefatafl might have been. How Hnefatafl might have been played. And then below that, we have the evidence section of the page, which is kind of centered around the world map that we have. So you can see here we have 22 pieces of evidence for Hnefatafl, which range from 790 to 1413, and they are plotted here on the map. And we have all of the different sources that provide us this evidence. So the map is interactive, so you can click on one of the pieces of evidence. So this is that little triangle there, and it gives us a little description of what that piece of evidence is. So this is an artistic depiction that is dated from the 11th century, the end of the 11th century. It's being played by men. It tells us that we have a square board with central and four corners squares marked and with two players. And then the content tells us what it is. So it's two men sitting across from each other on a board on a rune stone that has the central and corner spaces marked. And then we have the sources for that. And then what's also very useful about the database is we have the sources listed underneath the map there, and you can click on the sources and it will take you, if it's available digitally, it will take you directly to that source. So this is it's not as easy to see, but in kind of the center left of that picture, there's the drawing of the runestone there, and if it's digitally available, it'll take you directly to the source. If not, it'll take you to WorldCat, which is a tool that helps you find that source in a library near you. Now, Senate is a little bit more complicated. We have the board, the pictures of the board at the top. We have a short description of Senate, a description of some of the rules, and then we'll zoom in on the large number of rule sets that we have for Senate. So here we have all of the different kinds of rule sets. So we have, rule sets are divided into different kinds of types based on what they are. So we have scholarly and suggested rule sets, which are fully playable rule sets that have been made by somebody who has looked at Senate and decided how to play it based on what they know or what they think about the game. And we've divided these, we've kind of made these a little bit hierarchical. Scholarly rule sets are rule sets that come from someone who is knowledgeable about the game or culture specifically, who has done a considerable amount of research on that topic, whereas suggested rule sets come from people who are kind of usually more interested in games more generally, and who aren't necessarily as familiar with the historical evidence as someone who would be in a scholarly rule set. And in this case, we have reconstructed rule sets, which are not yet completed. These are kind of placeholders for us based on, for Senate, the different kinds of Senate boards that we have evidence for that show variations in the game. So this is, if you can click on the rule sets, and this is for the early New Kingdom Senate. It tells you, just a short summary of that it's played on a board common in New Kingdom Egypt, and then the rules. This is based on the different markings of the squares for Senate, and then we have the evidence for that specific rule set mapped and the sources for that as well. And then this is just to show this is one of this is the Kendall Scholarly Rule Set, which is a full set of rules that describes you how to play Senate according to his scheme. And then this is just to show you the map of all of the evidence for Senate, which I believe we have something like 300. So we are still in the process of compiling all of the data in our database. This map shows the earliest piece of evidence for each of the games that we have something documented for. We have over 3/4 of our database has at least one piece of evidence, so we still have about 250 to go to add something, and we will be adding more and more as time goes on. And then this map here shows all of the pieces of evidence that are points, not the ones that are not regions, showing kind of the geographic distribution. And we will also be filling this out as time goes on and as we collect more evidence. So all of this will be important for us to use our Ludi software and all of the methods we're planning to use for reconstruction and reconstructing these games. So I will pass it off to Matthew to talk to you about that.
Okay, thank you very much, Walter. So yeah, hi everyone. So I'm going to talk now about game reconstruction as part of the Digital Looting project. We currently have, as Walter was just talking about, we have over 1,000 games currently in our game database, but a large portion of these games currently have incomplete rules that don't allow us to fully implement those games. I think last time I checked, it was just under 200 of these games that didn't have a complete rule set. So the idea is for us to try and reconstruct these games. There's a bunch of them shown on the picture on the right there. And we're trying to reconstruct those games within our database using the evidence that we have, about the known evidence that we have. So the first step in this process is we're going to try and create an evidence profile for each of the games in our database. This evidence profile is intended to describe the dates and locations where that game was likely to be played. So just as an example, the game of 58 Holes is a game in our database, and the evidence for that game indicates that the game was played likely sometime between 2200 and 300 BCE. and that the region where that game was played was probably around Northern Africa in the Egyptian region and Southwestern Asia. Again, this is all based on the evidence for the game that has been collected and stored in our database. We're also working with the company Geacron, who is providing us with a database of political entities and trade routes. And so using this, we aim to create a geopolitical social network that measures the distance between different political entities. And then based on this, we can estimate the distance between two games. Essentially, each game would be associated with the political entities that contain evidence of it. And then the distance between two games would be the number of political entities that separate them. So for example, if we found two different games in exactly the same region at exactly the same time period, these games would have a distance of 0. If instead one of those games was in a different political entity, but it was on the border of the original one, then that would be a distance of 1. If these two games were in political entities connected by a trade route, it would also be a distance of 1. And so we can build up this network to estimate the distance between any games, regardless of where they are in the world and in what time period. Okay, so how does this geopolitical social network of games, if we create that, how does that help us to try and reconstruct these games? Well, we're working under the current hypothesis that games which are closer to each other in this network, that are closer in this geopolitical network, are more likely to share common game concepts. Now, what do I mean by common game concepts? Well, this includes everything from the equipment of the game, so like the board shape or the pieces that were used, the rules of the game. So if what the ending conditions were, how you win the game, how the pieces move, maybe how you capture pieces, or if you even can capture pieces, and also potentially some gameplay concepts. So this would be things like how long the game typically takes to complete. If luck plays a significant factor in the game, obviously you have games like Game of the Goose, which are 100% luck, and games like chess, which are 100% skill, but there's a wide spectrum of luck-based games in the middle. Things like rule complexity would be another example. And so we are trying to collect this collection of concepts and analyze them within these games to see if this hypothesis is true, if games which are closer, geopolitically closer, do in fact share, are more likely to share common game concepts. And if we find this hypothesis to be true, then when reconstructing our games, we can take inspiration from other nearby games in the network. The idea being that maybe the rules of a previous version of a game influence future versions, or that games from a specific time and region perhaps favored certain game concepts. And so I think that this idea is best shown through just a few examples. The first one I'm going to show is Dola, which is a game with evidence dating it around 1883 CE. And for this game, we only found the board, I believe, and it was a Pachisi-style board design. And so we think that it's likely that it probably shared some concepts and rules with other nearby games with a similar board. So what we would do is we would say, okay, we've found evidence for this board here. Let's look at all the games that are the known games that are around that geopolitically using our network. Find which ones also have a similar board, and then we would base the reconstruction for this initial game, Dola, on the rules for the nearby games found around it. Another example, based on one that Walter previously mentioned for Niffertafel, is that we have the game Tablut, and we might want to use this as a basis for reconstructing the other Tafel games. So for Tablut, we have evidence that it was observed in 1732 CE in the Scandinavian region. We also have evidence for the other Tafel games like Niffertafel in a similar time and place, and these games obviously have a very similar board design. And so it's not a stretch to assume that these games probably had similar rules and similar game concepts. Maybe the pieces moved in a similar way, maybe the ending conditions were very similar, this sort of thing. And lastly, I want to show an example for this ancestral Apache game, which was found in Arizona, I believe, around that area, dating back to around 1280 to 1580 CE. And so for this game, this game was only found based on archaeological evidence. We only have archaeological evidence of the board. We have no idea how the game was played. However, all the other known Native American games around that same time and place with a similar board design heavily used dice, or at least used dice in some capacity. So it's not a stretch to surmise that this game, it's highly likely that this game also used dice in some capacity. So that's the general idea. We would really like to know what you in the community think about this. The game network, this geopolitical game network, is expected to come later this year to estimate this measure of geopolitical distance between games. And we're currently also working on developing an extensive library of different game concepts, everything from the board shape and design, the pieces, the rules of movement, and even some of these gameplay things. So we would really love to hear your opinions and ideas about this. Do you think this is a valid hypothesis? Do you have any insight into certain concepts that you think maybe were favored in particular times and places that might provide good validation for this? At this stage, this is all fully just a hypothesis. We would obviously need to verify this with the known games before we proceeded with any game reconstruction for the unknown rules. So yeah, that's the end. Thank you very much for listening. All the details about how to contact us are here. Walter and I will now be available to answer any questions that you have. And if you have any opinions, any questions, anything at all, we would love you to let us know.